Hi, Karsten.
um, it's good to see. Awesome. When in the moment I basically turn on the live stream, your Skype is changing everything.
It's
It's
not my
now
Skype.
I have a frozen picture. Awesome, awesome. That's the way it is supposed to do. Interestingly enough, I see you. So, Jeff, let's do it that
Yeah,
way. Um, Hi, Jeff. Good to see you. Good to have you here. Jeff, would you mind shortly introducing yourself to the audience? Who are you? And what is your purpose in this awesome conversation we are going to have?
sure. So, yeah, my name is Jeff Chousterman, and I'm working for Cloudical as cloud engineer and mostly as cloud developer, specialized for automation and yeah, stuff in this regards. And my supposedly reason to take place or to attend this conversation is bring my perspective and ask my specific questions and viewpoints on open source or open source software solutions. How much do they cost? What are they supposed to bring into your company?
Exactly. So we will do that as a conversation. That's basically the idea. If you are in the Zoom meeting, feel free to ask. Feel free to, push us. If you are attending via our live stream, well, again, feel free to ask. We are going to show the questions as they pull in. So, the idea of this webinar is basically, well, it's first of all not to show you in a small way. The idea of this webinar is basically that we have a conversation about open source and the true costs of open source. Interestingly enough, Jeff, you are now completely lost here. That's just great. That's just awesome and great. There are days and I see you. There you are. That is interesting. I'm going to re-add you to that screen because I feel like we should stick in that screen here. So while I fix that, I can try to give a short idea why and what about this conversation is. So just several weeks ago, I saw a email by a basically an open source company, and that email truly scared me because it basically read open source software where is just expensive. I was like, how is that possible? Because open source software per se is understood as, yeah, a software that is free. How can it be expensive? Isn't it to some extent the other way around, that open source software would give you a completely different access to software? We will touch on that because that made me truly a little bit suspicious. And I'm afraid Jeff is it. No, Jeff is back. I feel like today the internet is not that good. Perhaps it should be open source internet. But Jeff, when we speak of projects, and you are a developer, and frankly, you are a pretty good developer. What is your take on that on a very broad scale? Is open source software per se a cost factor in projects, or are there other things associated with that?
So my take on that, pretty as from specifically from developer perspective, I'm pretty much familiar with open source, and nearly everything I worked on has to be, let's not say has to be, but it is pretty much often open source if we talk about, for instance, programming languages, frameworks we are working with. So tool sets you get on your hands. Mostly tool sets we use are open source. Basically, nearly every framework I know of, which wasn't open source, died out or has a pretty small foot standing on. It's difficult for those pay to win frameworks to succeed. Also because there is just a little amount of developers actually working with those specific frameworks. So even if you, from company perspective, from software engineering perspective, even if you're a company which specifically works with a certain framework which is pay to win, you oftentimes have a pretty hard standing on the market to get developers actually into your company, because there is no one on the market, on the whole market, to actually have experience, to be senior in his knowing, in his doing. Most of the times they are familiar with similar frameworks, but start as junior. So if you try to achieve a high level software structure, it's difficult. It's just difficult.
Okay. So what you are basically saying, and let me transform that into a perhaps a little bit more general kind of approach. Basically, without open source software, there is no software development, and there is no modern cloud environments and ecosystems, right?
Yep.
What is then basically, if you can assume that open source software should be there, what could be the driving factor for those who say open source is making things expensive from your perspective? Is that open source, or is that perhaps something different?
I think most of the times, so what I have encountered oftentimes in companies on projects, that those who are actually buying in resources are not the ones using those resources. And the ones who make those decisions, what we want to buy, what we want to use in our company, those are most often people.
As somebody, and I'm just realizing we have some connection difficulties, but not towards Zoom, more towards the free internet. But we anyhow continue on it. What I realized there is basically that the thing that is often perceived to be the expensive thing isn't the expensive thing. So quite often companies start by saying, well, look, our licensees or the licensing is expensive, or in regards to open source software, it's a long day, to open source software, the support and the subscription is expensive. But when you look at when you look at what is actually the main thriving factor in regards to finances and regards to costs, that is just a pretty small amount, pretty much regardless of whether it is open source software or proprietary software, because those kind of expenses, they are calculatable. Even if you feel like, okay, I have to pay like a 5-digit sum per year or per month even, that's calculatable, because ultimately, that's ultimately just if you happen to pay so much money, you can basically assume that your infrastructure costs are going to be way higher, and you can assume that that basically the costs of running those things, not on the infrastructure side of things, but on the human side of things, and the costs of setting up things, of customizing things, that those costs are way higher than just the infrastructure costs. Before we continue on that, we should touch from my perspective on one pretty important thing, and that is basically the question: what actually is the business model behind open source? Because it's important to understand that before we continue. Let me perhaps touch on that pretty shortly.
Yeah, sure.
So the business model for an open source company is not software licensing. It's not. What you do as an open source software company is you publish your software. You make it available using an appropriate license, such as an Apache license or what have you, and you continue from there. So that is basically the way you are executing. And you might ask, okay, what do I make the money with then? And the money is made basically by selling subscriptions, by giving customers access to a support team. So what we, for example, as Cloudical do with VanillaStack is we don't sell you a software. The software is free of charge. You can use it the way you want it to use. What we basically sell you, if we sell you something, it's a bad term, but obviously we need to sell you something because we need to pay for my coffee. So what we sell you is support and customization for the software. And that is a pretty major difference because it makes the software available to you. You just can use the software, just download it, install it, and off you go. There might be differences in editions. With VanillaStack, basically the difference is that the community edition is a rolling distribution, whereas the commercial edition is a more static, fixed version. So you can basically rely when you use the static version, the commercial version. You can basically rely on the different parts and the different aspects of the environment to work together, which is not 100% ensured on the community edition, because when a new project is rolling out something new, well, could be that it is going to break something. You buy into that static version and you buy into some sort of an insurance, right? If something goes wrong, if you are stuck with something, call the support and then you get your support. So, but that is a pretty important difference and a pretty important differentiation between open source software and commercial software, because
it's also a difference, I might add, between open source software and what I see as open source, for instance, frameworks, because normally there is no support for frameworks. You either know them or how to use them. You haven't have a subscription-based operation in there. But as you talked about software, yes, that's also a major case. For instance, if I have to develop on specific environment setups, that those environments, if they are open source, or first of all, I have a much better Google solution normally on open source. So
wait, that's Jeff, don't laugh about that, because that is a pretty important aspect, and that is, if we speak of cost factors, if we speak of things that make your journey expensive, the fact that you are able to get support for your open source product, for your open source environment, without having to pay for it, is a pretty important thing. Although, frankly, you obviously get better support if you pay for it. Well, but the point is, in our case, you do. The point is, and that is pretty important. The point is that the support is always there. The entry into the ecosystem the entry into what you are ultimately using and what you are ultimately seeing is way more relaxed compared to the likes of a proprietary software, because with a proprietary software you have to basically pay up front just to be able to use it, and then you have to pay another kind of fee for enabling your people to work with that proprietary software, because nobody else knows about that software, right? So the more open source and the more community driven a software is, from my perspective, the better it is, because I can gain knowledge pretty much anywhere. As you said, I have Google at my disposal. Well, let me put it that way. I have DuckDuckGo at my disposal, but that's a different story. But the point is, I just have that on my disposal. I can rely on that, and I'm able to call a big and broad community for help before or even when I had spoken to the support of my specific vendor. So the level of support I might work with is way bigger, isn't it?
It is, in my opinion at least. And from experience with several web-based applications from certain vendors, I don't want to call names, but
we want to avoid it, but I feel like we will touch on that. I know us. I can
tell you so much. With the big M at the beginning. There are certain tools, even if you have... What? McDonald's, yes, that's right. Even if you have the biggest support you can get, oftentimes their proprietary software isn't really adaptable to your environment. So you have to adapt your environment to that software, which of course they help you oftentimes with, but that's a specific case where you have to adapt your own environment you're working on just to work with a specific software. And this is oftentimes more work and costs a lot more than, for instance, using open source, because most of the times open source is dependent on several different setups or environments, and is oftentimes also tested on several different environments. And this in the end is not only you have the possibility for your ops team to gain knowledge just by Googling solutions which other users already come across, but also to know that a specific software is not forcing you to adjust your specific environment or to open up leaks you don't want to open.
Yeah, that's a very, very important aspect you were just touching upon. That ability to make the software and the ecosystem work for you instead of having to rely on something somebody said would be best for you. And the ability, again, as we already pointed out, to talk to a community, to have knowledge there, instead of just being reliant on a whatever and wherever located support team that might not even be able to speak and understand you with your problem and to speak your language. So that is from my perspective pretty important, and that is a very, very important aspect of the whole question. What is actually and what will be the main driving force in regards to finances, in regards to costs of a project? So Jeff, I don't know how it is with your development experience. Do you make up, or do you see from your development experience any major quality differences between open source solutions and proprietary solutions, or perhaps even between different open source solutions? Because we are going to touch on that with different open source solutions in a few seconds as well.
That's a major point I want to come with.
Please, go ahead. Feel free to touch on that.
So I mean, in regards of proprietary software, I mean, there's pretty much everything explained besides maybe a conclusion from your side, because from my thinking, it's always abstract. I have not really done some project management, so I don't know exactly the cost of workforce for, let's say, open source frameworks or open source software development, and the same thing for, let's say, some proprietary perspective. I assume that people or developer with knowledge in some specific niche product which is proprietary might cost more, and from my perspective, workforce is the most expensive thing in software development.
Jeff, stop here, stop here,
yeah.
stop here, because that is something you should repeat. It's the I repeat it. Workforce.
Yeah.
So the hours of work you spend is, at least from a human perspective, typically during the development phase of a product, we have to say, the most expensive thing. And if I touch on what you just said, that you said basically that with proprietary software, you need to have more specialized people in your team, so they, since they are more specialized, cost more. So just connect those two dots, dear audience. So proprietary software, specific proprietary product related knowledge that is hard to gain, that is hard to find on the market. And since it is hard to gain and hard to find on the market, will increase directly the costs of your development cycle. I can guarantee you that. And absolutely right, Jeff, in that regard. So again, if we just make the comparison between proprietary software and open source software, it's not true for every case. We have to be fair there. But you can basically assume that a proprietary software developer with proprietary software knowledge is harder to find and therefore more expensive. I would definitely sign that. But, dear Jeff, I know that you are not only working as a developer, you are also working as an automation engineer, and as somebody who is integrating products, open source products for customers. What is your experience there? Is every open source software alike, or are there differences?
I think there are major differences. In my opinion, there are basically two parties in the open source community. One party, which is truly open source, means go to GitHub or GitLab or wherever the Git repositories are, pull the code, compile it, here you go. And then there are other ones who make life really hard for developers. Not only that documentation are only accessible if you are registered, and not all documentations are available even if you're registered, but you have to take several additional steps. It's like
from time to time, Jeff, you even need to be certified for a product before you even can access the documentation. What is that?
I mean, the major point I took with me is, if my company, for instance, have no contract or has no partnership with certain companies, even if I want to spend it on my personal own time just to gain additional knowledge, it's like in chemistry, you have your activation energy you have to gain, and as developer, you try to be as low on this part as possible. So if there is no catalyst in the way, you don't get access to it. Because for me, even just the registration part is a thing I might not accept. So I try to gain documentation from wherever I can find them on Google. But as soon as there is a login required, I might step back and just accept my defeat. But that's one major point I see, for instance. The question is, what are those companies gaining in making those accesses this difficult? Because I think they pretty much limiting community access. But what is
I feel like they it's a good question. They intentionally do that, I feel like, because what they want to do is they want to lock you in their ecosystem. They want to impose some vendor locking on you. With open source software, it's quite hard to achieve if you are truly open source in that regard. The problem is that, let me put it that way, just because you make your source code available, the software is not necessarily usable, right? Let's take a completely hypothetical example. I would be a software company. Let's call me Black Fedora. Black Stetson. That's a nice little name for a software company. Black Stetson. And that Black Stetson software company is providing its customers with great and awesome looking and feeling Kubernetes software products. Well, what they try to do to maximize revenue, because they might have been bought by the American Typewriter Incorporated just 2 years ago. Again, just completely hypothetical kind of thinking we have here. They might have been bought by those guys, and they need to, bring back the 35 billion of hypothetical dollars that the other companies spent. So what they are going to do and what they will do is basically they will open source the software, obviously, but they will lock down the software. So you basically need to use their installer. It will be locked down in a way that is perhaps only running on top of their Black Stetson Enterprise Linux. It will possibly just be usable after you registered, and you just get access to the documentation after you've proven that you took an expensive certification trail. What they claim is they are open source, and in fact the software is open source, but you just can download it and you need to build it yourself. You need to do all the heavy lifting yourself. So they basically give you open source, but they basically don't give you community. They don't give you access to what they do, because they basically use that open source moniker as some sort of cover, as you would do with a Black Stetson. You would cover your head. Basically, their idea is maximum of revenue, minimum of community, and that's you basically said it the other way around. With a community-driven approach, with an open source approach, you would be able to gain knowledge, and you would not have to pay for it. You would be able to ask your peers for support, and you would not have to pay for it. And their fear is that you, as the customer, basically would not become their customer, although perhaps their product might even be superior, which they claim it is, although it isn't. But that's a different story. So the idea and the motivation behind that is to lock you into the ecosystem, to make you pay for every single step, and now comes the infamous part, or the evil part. They want to make you afraid of open source software, because, and that is what they say, with open source software you don't get their professional support, and with open source software you will be left alone in case of a problem. And with open source software, you don't get that warm, nice feeling when working with their products, because their products might look amazing. So what they want to do is they want to scare you, and they want you to become a part of their ecosystem. And frankly, from a commercial perspective, let me put it that way, I can definitely understand that, because, well, revenue maximization is a great thing. But from a software perspective, from a community perspective, from a perspective of a customer, I basically would say, well, perhaps I should not wear a black Stetson, because it could be that it would not fit my head, and it would perhaps not fit my budget. And it would actually impose way higher costs than using a software that is open source, paying for the support when you need it, or the way you need it. Let me put it that way. You can definitely pay for support when you need it, or you can do your subscription and get your support basically as some sort of insurance. But that would perhaps not sound sexy enough. That would perhaps not sound financially attractive enough. So again, what they do is they play big major company. They basically use the same arguments as a Microsoft is using against open source software. They are using the same arguments towards open source software. They try to scare people off, and they just want to do a business.
But even Microsoft is opening up past 2-3 years. They start migrating into the open source world. And the question what I would raise in this case is, do I have to be scared of open source, if you want to tell? So are there examples of companies which provide you with open source, so with truly open source software, and give you actually good support? So are there examples for this? Do you know of any?
I'm pretty sure, Jeff, that is a hypothetical question, because I know of such a company, and you are the employee of such a company. So you are employed by such a company. No, that is basically what we want to do with VanillaStack and with our offering there. We don't want to lock in people, because we truly believe that, and to some extent, we have been users for years of cloud native stacks, of cloud native software. And what we believe in is, if I want to use such a software in a production grade environment and in a production grade way, I will voluntarily seek my support. I will voluntarily opt for a subscription. But from a, for example, development perspective, and from a, for example, proof of concepts perspective, where I just want to ensure that perhaps something is working the way I intended to work, or where I just want to develop on an environment, well, just look at us. We would not like to pay for that, because that is upfront investment, and we have to we have to basically get that money back from our customers. So what we want to use, and what basically I'd say most of the people in the market would do, the potential customers would do, is they would say, okay, let's use the community version, where a community version makes sense, speaking of VanillaStack, but then go and opt for the commercial version and the commercial edition, where that makes sense in commercial environments, in environments where I need to have that kind of insurance, where I need to have that backing. So that is basically, first of all, the way we are seeing things there, without shameless marketing plug. But we feel we discussed that a lot, and you are part of the team that discussed that. We thought of, or we had a discussion whether to make some sort of registration a requirement, or whether to actually make the community version available, or just to hide it away, like other companies do, like Brett Stetson, for example, does it. And we decided not to go that route because we feel like, again, if you want to use the product commercially in a productive way, you want to pay for it. Truly, I would say I want to pay for it because I don't want to be left alone just with an awesome community, but with a community in case my business critical workloads are running into any kind of issues. I want to have a support that is there 24/7. I want to have a support that basically knows the product in and out, and that is basically able to fix my problems. There's nothing against, don't get me wrong, there's nothing bad with a community-driven approach per se and in detail, not at all. But in case I want to go productive, I want to have my support subscription at my disposal. And if I don't need it, well, perfect. Then I understand it as some sort of an insurance. But what you have to do with, for example, the Black Stetson offerings, you basically have to pay a lot of money up front. Not perhaps in regard to licenses, because again, their software is open source. But in regard to empowering your people, in regard to enabling them, in regard to getting on the track, in regard, we had a similar discussion this morning, in regard to perhaps certified infrastructure, in regard to Linux distributions that you are allowed to run that specific software upon. Yeah. So you pay double, twice, 3 times, 4 times the money than you would do with a true open source approach. And why do you do that, you ask? Good question, Jeff. Glad you asked. It's basically because many of those companies, like the Black Stetson company, for example, have turned into huge enterprise companies with a lot of overhead, with sales people that want to drive their Mercs, and so on and so forth. And you pay for that. So that is why they turned into something completely different than they started to be in the beginning, because if you look at their past, the Black Stetson company, for example, is like 26, 27 years of age, and they started exactly where, for example, we are sitting in now, as a truly open source approach, as an open source approach, as an approach that is approachable, that is community driven, and that does not try to lock you in. So the point I'm trying to make is, even if you think of open source as something that might save you money, it does not necessarily save you money. It saves you money, and Jeff, you are definitely allowed to disagree or to add another aspect there, but it saves you money when the software and the infrastructure you are using is as community driven as possible, because then you have the biggest knowledge around. You can leverage most of knowledge that is available on the market. It saves you money when it does not lock you in regard to what you want to do now or what you want to do in like 3 years from now. It saves you money when you have an upgrade path, and with a community-driven approach, with an open source approach, you always have that kind of upgrade path. Even if a project would be abandoned by one of the companies doing it, it would still be available. There would still be a community, and in case of VanillaStack, which we don't abandon at all, don't get me wrong, but in regards to our project, it would still be able to redo everything we did, because we purposely on purpose used the vanilla, the community projects, because to us, vendor lock is basically the worst thing that could happen. I can tell you a short story, if you allow me to.
Sure.
A developer story. Like 20 years ago, we didn't have anything like Kubernetes. When we wrote software back then, we most often wrote Java software, and that Java software ran within Java EE application service. And there were several contenders in the market, like BEA, like IBM, like later on Oracle, and so on and so forth. And you had different pricing points for the products. You could start with JBoss, which was pretty inexpensive, if not free, but had a professional tier. And you could on the other hand use something like WebSphere by IBM or BEA WebLogic, which later got acquired by Oracle. So all of those servers were certified to be Java EE application service, and there's a striking similarity to Kubernetes, but I'm going to touch on that in a few seconds. They were certified to be Java EE application service, and that basically meant and implied that as long as your application is Java EE application server compatible, basically sticking to the rules of a Java EE application, it would run on any of those platforms. There might have been differences in performance, there might have been differences in, I don't know, the way you are running and rolling out things, but basically your application would have been able to run there. So where was the differentiation point? Well, the differentiation point for those application server providers was to bring in additional functionality, additional features that was proprietary. So a true fact, a true story. I was this must be like 6-7 years ago. I was assigned to a project which was deeply integrated into IBM WebSphere. Don't get me wrong, awesome product. WebSphere was and is an awesome Java EE application server. But what IBM, for example, did is they added their own authentication layer. So that authentication layer was quite easy to set up, it was quite easy to configure, it was quite easy to integrate, and it was quite easy proprietary. And the customer, which was the dealer organization of one of the biggest German car manufacturers, the customer basically integrated with that because they did not know better. And all the representatives and all the webcasts and all the tutorials said, yeah, use that nice, awesome authentication layer because it's so easy, it's so simple, it's the best thing you could do. Like 5, 6, 7 years later, when I got assigned to the project, they tried to get rid of that because they decided they wanted to move over to JBoss, a different vendor. What they did ultimately was they had to pay a team for roughly 18 months to basically factor the old authentication layer out and implement a new standard conformant authentication layer, because you already had authentication layers and authentication functionalities, but they were not so nicely usable. So it did not work out well, because what they might have saved initially in regard to writing the software, in regard to integrating or by integrating into the proprietary authentication layer, got completely blown out of the water like several years later when you tried to get rid of that, because it was so deeply integrated. You had to basically get it out, you had to rewrite your whole software, you had to reintegrate many modern things or many standard things, common things there, and it cost them a shitload of money. And that is the problem with an open source platform being turned into something vendor specific. And now we are talking present time, because in the present time you have an awesome platform that is pretty much the standard, that is Kubernetes. Then you have vendor specific platforms that are adding additional features to the game. For example, the Kubernetes platform of Black Stetson it calls itself Open something. I forgot the name. It calls itself Open something. The problem is with that platform, for example, it's a great platform. And you can use it without any kind of vendor login. If you just stick to the functionalities and to the features you have with Kubernetes, or if you install additional tools and additional frameworks, as everybody doing Kubernetes stuff would recommend you and would ask you to do. But what they do is they bundle a lot of additional tools in there, which is, by the way, a good thing per se. But they try to lock you into their ecosystem. So with their version 3, for example, or with previous versions, they did not even give you access to the standard, to the default Kubernetes management tools. You had to use their own proprietary stuff. And they do it again. They bundle, for example, authentication features that are highly, highly proprietary. And they recommend you using those tools because it's easier to set up, it's easier to use, and what they don't tell you, it gets you into their ecosystem. You have no chance of getting out of it. It goes as fast as to give you a white paper, which basically lays out while their Open Something platform is completely Kubernetes compliant. Well, let me put it that way. If you don't vendor lock your platform, you don't have to do such a white paper because your platform is standard compliant. And that is that is all of the problem. You pay for getting locked down to something. You pay for short-term advantages instead of seeing the advantages long-term. And with true open source, you have the advantages to stick to, well, the standards. You have the advantage to use all the default tools that are supposed to work with such a platform. Yes,
that's one major point.
Yeah, and you might. I let you talk in a few seconds. You might need. I just want to touch back onto a point that you actually touched. You might need to train people on the standard. You might perhaps do like 5 days more of coding for specific things. You might need to solve problems. Yes. But you solve them using the standard platform. You solve them using standard tools. You solve them ideally using true open source solutions, which allow you to later on move on. Head over to the next platform. Head over to the next product. Head over to the next big thing instead of locking you in. And that, from my perspective, and you see that I'm truly exaggerating there, that, from my perspective, is the main problem with Black Stetson and or with all those other kind of approaches that try to vendor lock you. Period. Go ahead. I need to take a short break.
I just had to hold it back because I had early on a question and now you already answered it, because one of the major points, in my opinion, is also, like you already explained, to get locked in. Not only to get locked in, but to be forced to use certain tools, which, okay, they are included, so they most often are not additional costs in the first place. But if you later on try to move on to newer things, and I mean, we are in a business where tomorrow is the next technology. Tomorrow is already the next technology around. So you have always to move fast to be on the stream. Especially in development, tools change each and every time, each and every year. You have new frameworks, you have new sets.
And you have to pay each and every year again if you bet on the wrong horse there. You have to repay every year.
That's one thing I have at least no experience with, but I can imagine it's pretty expensive. Migration from your lockdown vendor state, from your Black Stetson group with their closed leap, let's call it, the software. And if you're locked down in this specific situation or other tools they offer, you have to use their databases, for instance, for your user management. How does it look like, and how expensive is it actually for a company to migrate later on to a new set of tools, to a new environment?
You won't do that. That's the problem, because you paid for it, and you continue paying for it, so it better has a value, right? So
you are forced to use it in this case, even though
we're speaking of psychology there. Since you paid a lot of money for it, it is a great thing, and since you continuously pay for it, it is to be supposed to be cutting edge, because they tell you it is. So that's a psychology thing. That's why, for example, they make such a fuss and such a branding around that. They try to brand something that is already there. That's, from my perspective, pretty much comparable to a company that is trying to sell you water because, well, they can do. And if you are going to buy that water, well, let me put it that way. In a supermarket, I'm also buying water, right? But if you are going to buy water without knowing that you can basically get it from your water supply at home, and that water is basically as healthy as the one you get in the supermarket. Well, let me put it that way. That's why they have their nice little bottles, and that's why there is a marketing around that. That's why there is a branding around that, because they want you to feel special. Well, the sheer truth is, how do I put it without sounding rude? If you buy their products without understanding that you could have it for free, you are not special. Let me put it that way. They try to emotionalize that. So, and then there is another aspect, and that is the last aspect I want to touch upon. What I often read is like that with open source software you have security issues because the community is not that reliable. Before I let you speak about that, I give you my thoughts there on a very short note. It is the community product you are using. Even if you pay the Black Stetson premium, you still use the community product. They just, branded it differently. So might be that they have a fix for something like a week earlier. But ultimately, and that is part of the game, that is part of what they basically signed to do, they have to put it upstream. So you get the same fixes for the community product and the same quality as you get for their premium product. In fact, most of the fixes they have to do is for their own custom overlay and not for the community product, because the community product is way more thoroughly tested. The community product is the product, and that is something they want to, and they try to become you scared upon. Like, with the community product there is no security. Well, no, it's completely the other way around from my perspective. What's your take? No, it's
not only from your perspective. There's always the saying in development departments, security through obfuscation. it's not truly security.
Security by obscurity, yeah. Great thing.
And that's the only thing proprietary software does in this way, because you have no access to their source code. And if you have a closed environment for your open source software, it's not really completely the same, but it's nearly the same. So if you have 10 eyes who look on the same page of code, they will find more issues than if you just have one developer.
If they are skilled. But typically, and I just want to, that's again something you said up front. They are typically skilled because the knowledge is there. There's way more knowledge in the community than it is with a proprietary product.
Yeah.
It simply is. And even if you take a community product and make it something proprietary, which they do, Black Stetson, again, completely hypothetical case. Just to make that sure, because no company on the market would behave that way. But basically, if you take something community driven, make it proprietary or vendor lock it, exactly as you said, there is way less knowledge around that than around the community product. And that is true not only for development, that is true for operations, for pretty much everything in between. So again, just checkmark, seconding what you say. Please go ahead.
No, it's we were nearly done. So in my personal opinion, most of the large, truly open source software projects have more people look onto those codes. They use those projects or those applications, and oftentimes, if it is not truly a deeply buried down zero-day exploit, which is just the fact that your application interacts with the operating system you're running on in a strange way, most of code issues are actually found in community editions just by the community looking on it. And I first haven't believed it, but there are many people who use or spend their free time just as others do their crossword puzzles. They just read code on GitHub and wherever there is.
I know, we've seen it with our product as well. We are complete morons basically, because we do that, at least parts of that, in our spare time, and we still feel like it is enjoyable. How stupid could we are? Because if you would just use the Black Stetson product, well, they would have their full-time employees paid for that.
That's true, but we had fun on this regard. So finding issues is most of the times a thing we like to enjoy, and sharing this with our colleagues, telling them, hey guys, I found an issue, how do we fix it, or how can we fix it? And it is also enjoyable to get the attention from your colleagues that you found something inside that code that everyone thought of.
That is what one calls community. Exactly. And just from your perspective, not speaking of VanillaStack, more like generally, is community insecure? Is it I don't know, are you, in regards to community, you are in several projects, for example, is it like, okay, look, here is a problem, no, we don't fix it, no, we need to think about that. Is it going that way, or is it like, oh, look, there is a major problem, there is a huge thing, let's fix that first before we continue? How is it?
You're pretty much, so normally on software projects, the community would open up an issue, or if they are, more advanced, they can actually develop. This oftentimes also happens. They just push you a pull request with already a fix in place. So you not only have the thing, this finger pointing from the community, which is not only helpful, it is necessary to put your nose on your issues. And also you have the community to put in their work, their additional part into your software to also or already fix issues. So it is.
And now,
Yeah.
Jeff, comes the secret, which Black Stetson does not want to tell us. Their engineers are working on the community project, because the community project is the basis for their proprietary, more proprietary kind of offering. The same is true with Google, for example. Google is, for example, sponsoring a lot of Kubernetes development, and that sponsoring is not done by, don't know, raising money, although it is done that way, but by basically having people just working on those products, on Kubernetes, on several technologies there. Microsoft is working on Kubernetes. A number of SUSE Red Hat engineers are working on Kubernetes. Canonical engineers are working on that. Cloudical engineers are working on that. Day in, day out. So they are, and what they are doing is they work on the community project. They work on the upstream version of Kubernetes because it is a shared development approach. And then they take stable versions or not so stable versions and turn them into, perhaps not everybody's doing that, but turning them into proprietary solutions and claim they are more secure, they are, I don't know, more reliable, which they aren't. At least not for 99% of those who use it. In fact, there will always be like the 1% or perhaps 5 or 10% of customers that need to have specific functionalities, that perhaps need to rely on the completely hypothetical Black Stetson authentication mechanism. Well, perfectly fine. That's perfectly fine. That is absolutely, that's part of what you are allowed to do with that. That is basically turning it into your own thing. All they do in regards to technology is they have the right to do that. You basically do your check mark there and say, okay, yeah, obviously you are entitled to do that because it's an open source project. Just take the sources, rewrite them your way and so on and so forth, but don't forget to put them upstream, which they don't forget. Until that point, let me put it that way, I'm perfectly fine with the way they are executing. From my side, from my perspective, the wrongdoing basically starts when they claim that their product is, how do I put it, more secure than the other product. That it is giving you more freedom of choice than the base product, because it doesn't. It does not give you more freedom of choice. It gives you more specific choices in their product range because it locks you down to their product range. So that is the point where I feel like open source becomes very, very, very expensive if you choose to go that route. And that is the point where I'd say, if somebody asks me, what is the cost of open source? I'd say it's too expensive, because that is not the kind of open source that gives you freedom, that gives you knowledge, that basically allows you to transfer your knowledge. That is the kind of open source that is just happening to be open source, but basically is proprietary software because it is sold that way, it is locked down that way, it is basically made available the same way. Then it is, from my perspective, again, not the positive kind of open source. It is that kind of open source you want to avoid to save costs. So open source that truly saves you money, from my perspective, and it's basically, again, what you said already in your first statements, is that kind of open source that is not trying to lock you in, that is used by everyone, that's just there. And from a commercial perspective, there are two commercial perspectives there. The one commercial perspective is the commercial perspective of the user, of those who want to create production grade things with that. From their perspective, what they expect is basically to get their support, to get somebody in the game that might be able to fix issues, because every software has issues. That is what they expect. They don't expect a shiny new Merc arriving at their houses when they buy something like that. They expect problem solving, they expect support, and they perhaps expect it 24/7 and the ability to impose security on what they buy into. The other perspective is basically the perspective of those who create that kind of software. Totally get it that you want to make money. We want to make money, truly, frankly. And we urge all of our customers to pay for their VanillaStacks, to switch over to the commercial edition. But I feel like a company, an unnamed company, had once a claim that was called, like, don't be evil. That company is nowadays pretty much an evil company, but it's a different story. Again, my take on politics, but that's a different story. The point is, as a software vendor, I nod to that and I say, yes, exactly. We don't want to be evil. We don't want to basically milk our customers. We want to have a sustainable relationship. We want to have a long-lasting relationship. We want to have a relationship amongst equals, and not a relationship amongst, I don't know, vendor and user. Obviously, we have different kind of perspectives. We have different kind of duties, and different kind of responsibilities. Totally accept that. But I don't want to milk our customers. What I want to do, what we want to do, what the true open source projects and the companies behind those projects want to do is they want to grow with their customers. They want to have a long-lasting and sustainable relationship and don't want to make their customers pay for their 35 billion takeover. Just hypothetical. And again, if I would ask you, Jeff, we had such discussions, by the way, even when we started VanillaStack. When I would ask you, Jeff, to opt for something, what kind of framework would you use? What kind of software would you use? The one thing is always the technical feasibility that I would like you to answer and say, okay, look, that solves my problem, and so on and so forth. But the other thing I want you to keep in mind, and the other thing I want you to basically have in mind when doing decisions is how open is that project? How inclusive is it? How much is it trying to lock you in? It does not mean that we need to have the same kind of conclusions, but even when I'm asking you, I would like you to factor that in, to take that into consideration, because that is basically the thing that thrives, that increases or that lowers the total cost of ownership. My perspective on those things.
I'm totally with you on that.
Wait, I'm not able to hear you anymore. Yeah. But that could be that it is hopefully something with my kind of software. Jeff, please say something. Yeah, I now hear you again.
Test 1, 2, 3. Oh,
yeah, you are still audible. Again, I need to do that on Windows. Proprietary software.
Sure. No, I'm completely with you on your take. Most of the times when I specifically now as a software engineer, you mostly look for the biggest community, because those are so if you have, for instance, I mean, if you go into specifics, you already mentioned Google. Google has many frameworks in their name. If it is Angular or let's take Angular for example. For instance, it had a certain time, a place. It had the biggest community, so everyone went for this specific framework to develop in it, and this had a reason because most job searches were for Angular. Most knowledge share were on Angular. If you're developing a specific solution, it doesn't have to do with any software which is already existing, but you will encounter issues others already encountered, guaranteed. That's why in software engineering you learn about things like decorators and things like design solutions, which are de facto repeated solutions already known, and community projects.
Best practices,
Yeah,
absolutely.
of course, and community drives around those things because you have, let's call it swarm knowledge. You have many people who knows about those softwares, who encountered different issues with the software, who experience how to solve certain issues, who share their knowledge often. And as far as I know, so on issues I stuck with, I found always a solution through Google, through Stack Exchange, through places where people share their knowledge. And that's one major point, which first of all, it's a time solving solution for a developer. If I can do a quick Google search and not wait for a 4-hour ticket because we have the highest SLA thingy on Microsoft or something, and I have still to wait 10 plus hours for not a solution, but an additional request to to specify.
Most often you get something like, well, please have you looked there, and you immediately know it's just basically the take and the idea of basically getting rid of you because it's not factored in that you block their resources, although you are a paying customer. So what they want to do is they want to get rid of you. You have to pay. You have your point of contact, but that point of contact is not trying to solve your problem. Most often is not allowed to solve your problem for insurance reasons, and for basically legal reasons. So it is basically trying to get the responsibility back to you. So that is perhaps not with software development tools, but for example, quite often with infrastructure tools, the case. So yeah.
To get back to your question, so what I would really like to ask you after I stated maybe my conclusion out of this is I have two factors I would consider if I have to decide which way to go. This is first, of course, costs, because we are businesses. That's our first interest, to gain money. And secondly, it would be something like, how adaptive am I? Can I go forward in other possible ways? Is there something I have to consider if I have to move from this specific software? Am I locked in, how you already stated? Because this is one of the major things I like to not gain with actually buying a license.
So, you need to avoid getting locked in. Absolutely.
And those are mainly the two factors I consider first. And then oftentimes I ask different parties, different peers, communities, what their approach is in this specific circumstances. Because normally you have not only one software solution for a specific problem, you have different kinds. And nowadays I see
the magic word is choice.
Yep. To have the choice is one major point, oftentimes not considered by people buying in software. But what's your take, and maybe a final conclusion, or?
So my take is basically, if I want to save money, if I want to be sustainable with what I do in regards to software development, in regards to infrastructure, in regards to basically my ecosystem I'm living in, I would always try to stick as close to the vanilla version, no pun intended there, as close to the vanilla version. Well, okay, that pun is intended. Yeah.
The pun was intended in naming that thing that way.
Exactly. But I would stick as close to a vanilla version as possible. If I happen to buy into a proprietary or vendor locking product, I do that on purpose. I don't do that because it's shiny or it makes me feel warm or whatever. I do that because perhaps it is the best solution on the market. But still then, from an architectural perspective, from an infrastructural perspective, I would try to isolate that as much as possible, so it will not lock me in. At least it would not lock me in a way that I cannot control it anymore. So my take for saving money with software, with open source software, damn it, with my professional environment and with my production grade environment is to stick as close to the community versions, as close to the vanilla versions as possible, and get the right kind and the right amount of support, because I don't want to pay for a support I don't need. Or let me put it that way, it's best when I don't need the support, but I don't want to pay for things I would never need, like support for a specific project or product that basically somebody upsells me because the Ferrari is getting closer then. So exactly. So that is my take, and that helps me saving costs. And that helps me staying secure, frankly. And that helps me staying agile and moving on to the next big thing whenever I'm ready or whenever the thing is ready. So that is my takeaway. What's yours?
No, I could sign that off.
Well, Jeff, then let's sign that off here today. It's a pretty seldom thing that the both of us are of the same opinion, and I love it. That we have different opinions, and that we have different points, because that is a pretty important thing there as well. Community is around discussion, is around disagreement, is around trying to grow together, and not about being right. Well, that's then again a different thing that is driving knowledge or perhaps preventing.
The point of view on a specific software might be different. I mean, you see it from hacker communities as well. They just used software differently.
Yeah, absolutely. No, but the point is, before we start to turn circles, let's stop it here, because I feel like the point is made. The point is, stick as close to the vanilla versions as possible. Try to avoid vendor lock-ins. Do the right decision. Choose the right amount of support, but only when you need it. So I would again not pay support fees for a development environment. Unless I truly need it. Well, but then I happily pay for it. And that helps saving money. That helps cutting down costs. Way more efficient than moving from product A to product B, from vendor A to vendor B, because they are more fancy. They have a different color or whatever. So, Jeff, let's stop it here. Again, it was completely hypothetical. The company called Black Stetson does not exist. Hopefully will never exist. Let's call it a day. Thanks for the awesome discussion. Thanks for your awesome points. To everybody out there, stay safe and healthy.